Do you know how to create user-defined exception? User-defined exception is one of the important part in exception handling because it is required to satisfy business rules. What is user-defined exception? What are the rules to create user-defined exception and why we need user-defined exception? Till today we have seen a lot of sessions to learn exception handling. In this session we are going to learn theoretical background of user-defined exception. So please watch this video till the end and try to understand concept of user-defined exception. Welcome guys. In previous sessions we have seen a lot of points regarding exception handling. Now it's a time to create our own exception classes. Till now we have used a ready-made exception classes in our programming like arithmetic exceptions, IO exceptions, null pointer exceptions, array index out of bounds exception, and we have seen several different classes. But all these classes are ready-made classes. We have not created our own exception class. In this session, we are going to learn theoretical background about user-defined exception. Here, we have to understand what is user-defined exception. It is also known as customized exception. Then we are going to discuss why we need user-defined exception. What is need for such classes? And finally, we are going to discuss how to create user-defined exceptions. How can we create classes? And what are the rules that we have to satisfy while writing a program? So let us try to understand the concept of user-defined exception. So three questions we have to understand. What is user-defined exception? Why we need user-defined exception? And how to create user-defined exception. Let us begin with the first one. What is user-defined exception? Now, user-defined exception is a class which is created by a programmer. It is defined by a programmer. The classes we are using till now for exception handling, they are ready-made. But here, the exception class that we have to create, we have to write code for it. And that is why it is known as user-defined exception. It is also known as customized exception because this exception is customized by programmer. It is created by programmer. And one more important part, as this is not actual exception, it is created exception by programmer, then it will not occur automatically. Programmer has to write code to raise this exception by using throw statement. Now, this is the concept of user-defined exception. User-defined exception is a class which is created by a programmer. These are not exceptions from programming point of view, but these might be the exceptions. Those are created by a programmer for a purposeful situation, for a particular situation. They are also called as customized exception, and as they are not real exceptions from programming point of view, there is no logical misbehavior. These exceptions has to be thrown by a programmer by using a throw statement. Now let us see why we need such exceptions. If these are not real exceptions, why we need user-defined exception? Well, its answer can be given. We are developing programs for a particular business, and every business has some rules, and to satisfy such a business rule we need some exception class. Let us try to understand this with the help of example. Suppose we are developing a software for order processing system. Now here you can have different fields: order date and dispatch date, or delivery date, you can say order date and delivery date. Now when you are entering data, at that time order date and delivery date may be same, or sometime order date will be less than delivery date. So we will take order first, then only we can deliver. By mistake, if someone is entering order date which is greater than delivery date. That means what, you are delivering first and then you are taking order, which is not satisfying the business. And therefore, in such situations, these are not abnormal situations from programmer's point of view, because both are date. When there is a when you are developing an application, order date, that is also a date, dispatch date, that is also a date. So there is no problem from programming point of view, but from business point of view, order date should be less than or equal to delivery date. And in such cases, if it is not, this rule is not satisfied, then we can develop a exception class, date mismatch exception. And then such exception has to be raised programmatically by using a throw statement. So in a coding, we can see, we can put the condition, if delivery date is less than order date, then throw date mismatch exception. Now this is one need for satisfying business rule. Another one we can say is, if we want to avoid a particular logical situation, in that case also we can generate such user defined exception, and we can stop the programming, or we can alert to user that this exception is occurred. So to avoid logically unwanted situation in a program, we can create exceptions. So there are two possible reasons why we need user defined exception. Number one, to satisfy a particular business rule, or to avoid a logical situation which we don't want in a program. So in such cases, we can create user defined exception. Now the last question, how to create user defined exception? Now here, to create an user defined exception, we have to create our own exception class. And it is possible by extending existing exception class. So you have to create a new class which is a child, or which is a subclass of exception class. Every exception class in Java must be derived from general exception class. And therefore, if you want to create user defined exception, you have to create your own class by extending exception class. So if your class name is my exception, you can write like this: class my exception extends exception. Now this is the first rule. Your class must extend exception class. The second one, if you are creating an user defined exception, there must be some reason. Without reason, exception will not occur, or it should not occur. And therefore, it is mandatory to declare at least one private variable in exception class. In generally, it is of type string. And therefore, it is a second rule. One private variable must be there in user defined exception. And probably it is of type string, and that will store the reason why this exception is raised. In built-in classes also, you can see, when in previous session we have developed one program where exception is occurred, and that is because of division by 0. The exception class was arithmetic exception, but the reason why that arithmetic exception was thrown was division by 0. So division by 0 is a reason, and arithmetic exception is a class. In the same way, if you are creating your own exception class, you have to put its a reason somewhere, and that is why this private variable is mandatory. Now how the private variable will get the value? Now generalized exception class, ready-made exception class we don't create its object. Because of the situation, object will be created by Java itself, and therefore the reason will be added by Java itself. But in this case, as these are user defined situations where we have to create exception, the reason also has to be given by programmer. And therefore there is one more rule, that user defined exception class must have a constructor with arguments. Now the argument type must be similar to the private variable type. So here, when you are creating an exception programmatically, you have to pass the reason, and that reason will be stored in that private variable. So if your private variable of type string, then you can pass a reason as a string, and that will be stored in a private variable. So when you are creating exception by using constructor with argument, you have to pass the reason. So here you can write statement like this: throw, because you are throwing the statement, throw new your class name, that is if it is my exception, then throw new my exception, and in bracket reason why you are creating this exception. So this is how to create the exception. But one more rule is there. Generally, when we are catching the exception, we are displaying the reason. Okay, the caught this particular exception, and the reason is already available inside the object which is created by throw statement or created by Java, and we are directly putting the name. And internally it calls toString method of exception class. Now, if you are creating your own exception class, then it's a mandatory you have to write code for toString method, and in toString method you have to return a string that will contain the reason why this exception has been raised. So if you are continuing the example that we have seen, if you are creating a user-defined exception for date mismatch, so here if toString method is called, it should display order date should be less than delivery date. So that message is very important, otherwise user will not understand why this exception is raised or why this exception is occurred and what is the solution for it. And therefore these are the 4 rules. Number 1, your class must be the child class of exception class. Your class must contain at least one private variable. Generally it is of type string, but it is not mandatory that it should be string. Constructor with argument has to be written so that you can pass the reason why you are creating the exception while creating the object of exception. And finally, you must write code for toString method that will display the reason why this exception has been raised. So this is what the theoretical background of user-defined exception. In next session, I will give you the practical demonstration how to create this class, how to write this class, and how to raise such user-defined exceptions programmatically. So next session will be the total practical demonstration session, and this is just a theoretical background of user-defined exception. If you have got any value from this session, put your comments below this video. You have to put your comment how this session is useful for you or what you understood by this session. Your comments are very important for me because it is input for me and it gives me motivation to create such videos, and you can get new videos, new sessions from my side. Therefore, please put your comment, and if you haven't subscribed my channel yet, please subscribe my channel and watch my videos. Thank you very much.